The harsh ring of the telephone cut through the cigarette smoke that hung thick in Henry Blackwood's cramped Los Angeles studio apartment. He squinted through his hangover at the clock on the nightstand. 7:30 in the morning, far too early for decent human contact. The phone continued its relentless assault on his aching head as he stumbled across the cluttered floor, stepping over empty whiskey bottles and discarded contact sheets. "Blackwood Photography," he croaked into the receiver, his voice rough from too many lucky strikes and not enough sleep. "Mr. Blackwood, this is Margaret Collins from Walt Disney Productions. We have an urgent assignment that requires your immediate attention." Henry straightened up, suddenly more alert. Disney Productions meant money, and money meant he could keep the lights on for another month. "I'm listening." "Mr. Disney himself has requested a photographer to document the groundbreaking ceremony for his new theme park project in Anaheim. The pay is $500 for 3 days of work, plus expenses. Can you be there by 10 this morning? $500 was more than Henry had seen in months. The Korean War had ended the previous year, and work had been scarce for a combat photographer trying to make it in civilian life. "I'll be there." "What's the address?" "Drive south on Harbor Boulevard through Anaheim until you see the orange groves with construction equipment. You can't miss it. There will be trucks and bulldozers everywhere. Look for Mr. Disney's black Cadillac." Henry scribbled down the details on the back of an unpaid electric bill. "What kind of shots are you looking for?" "Progress photos, Mr. Blackwood. Mr. Disney wants to document every stage of construction for posterity. This is going to be the most magical place on Earth, and he wants the world to see how it's built." After hanging up, Henry moved with purpose for the first time in weeks. He loaded his camera bag with fresh rolls of film, checked his light meters, and cleaned his camera lenses until they gleamed. The 1952 Leica 3 had been his constant companion through the battlefields of Korea, and it had never let him down. Today, it would capture something far more pleasant than war. The drive to Anaheim took him through the sprawling suburbs of Los Angeles, past neat rows of ranch houses and manicured lawns where families were living the American dream. The morning sun beat down mercilessly on his beat-up Ford coupe, and he cranked down the windows to let the warm October air flow through the car. As he drove south, the urban landscape gradually gave way to endless rows of orange trees, their branches heavy with fruit that perfumed the air with a sweet citrus scent. This was California as it was meant to be, agricultural, peaceful, untouched by the rapid industrialization that was transforming the rest of the country. But that peace was about to be shattered. Henry spotted the construction site long before he reached it. Massive earth-moving equipment dotted what had once been pristine farmland, and clouds of dust rose into the clear blue sky as bulldozers carved new roads through the orange groves. The contrast was jarring, the violent intrusion of modern machinery into a landscape that had remained unchanged for decades. He parked his Ford beside a cluster of other vehicles and grabbed his camera bag. The sounds of construction were overwhelming after the quiet drive through the countryside, diesel engines roaring, hydraulics hissing, and the constant beep of trucks backing up. Workers in hard hats moved with purpose across the torn earth, transforming Walt Disney's vision into reality one shovelful at a time. "You must be the photographer," called a voice behind him. Henry turned to see a middle-aged man in a perfectly pressed suit approaching, despite the dust and heat that was making everyone else look wilted. The man's smile was warm, but his eyes held the calculating look of someone accustomed to getting exactly what he wanted. "Walt Disney," the man said, extending a firm handshake. "Thank you for coming on such short notice. I trust Margaret explained what we need." "Progress documentation, Mr. Disney. I understand this is going to be quite a project." Walt's eyes lit up with an enthusiasm that seemed almost childlike. "Henry, you're about to witness the birth of something that will bring joy to millions of families. This isn't just an amusement park. It's a place where dreams come true, where parents and children can experience magic together." As Walt spoke, gesturing expansively toward the construction site, Henry found himself caught up in the man's infectious enthusiasm. Here was someone who truly believed in what he was creating, who saw beyond the dust and noise to something magnificent. "Where would you like me to start, Mr. Disney?" "Call me Walt, and I'd like you to get some shots of me with the bulldozers, something that shows we're really breaking ground here, making progress. The investors need to see that their money is being put to good use." Henry nodded and began setting up his equipment. Through his viewfinder, he composed the shot carefully, Walt Disney standing confidently beside a massive Caterpillar bulldozer, the California sun casting dramatic shadows across his face. In the background, orange trees stretched toward the horizon, a reminder of what this land had been before ambition transformed it. But as Henry focused the lens, something caught his eye in the freshly turned earth near Walt's feet. Something small and pale, partially buried in the rich, dark soil. Something that looked disturbingly like a child's face staring up at them from beneath the ground. Henry's finger froze on the shutter button. Through the camera's viewfinder, the pale object in the dirt became clearer. Delicate features carved in what looked like porcelain, half buried in the freshly turned earth. A child's doll head, its glass eyes staring blindly upward, its rosebud lips slightly parted as if caught mid-scream. "Is everything all right, Henry?" Walt's voice seemed to come from far away. Henry lowered the camera, blinking hard. When he looked at the spot again with his naked eye, the doll head was still there, partially obscured by clods of dark soil, but unmistakably real. A chill ran down his spine, despite the warm October sun beating down on his shoulders. "There's something in the dirt, Walt. Near your left foot." Walt looked down and frowned. "I don't see anything. Just dirt and rocks." Henry raised his camera again and peered through the viewfinder. The doll head was clearly visible, its porcelain surface cracked but intact, blonde ringlets of hair matted with soil. But when he gestured for Walt to look where he was pointing, the older man just shook his head. "Henry, we've got a schedule to keep. The investors will be here this afternoon, and I need those progress photos before then." Something was wrong. Henry had spent 3 years in Korea documenting the horrors of war, and his eyes had never failed him before. He trusted his camera more than his own memory. It didn't lie, didn't embellish, didn't let emotion cloud the truth. And right now, his camera was showing him something that Walt Disney couldn't see. "Of course, Mr. Disney. Let me just—" Henry knelt down near the spot where he'd seen the doll head, pretending to adjust his equipment while getting a closer look. The object was definitely there. He could make out individual eyelashes painted on the porcelain, could see where the head had been severed cleanly from the doll's body. But when he reached out to touch it, his fingers found only loose earth. "Strange light conditions today," he muttered, standing up and brushing dirt from his knees. "Sometimes the camera picks up things the naked eye misses." Walt smiled. "That's why we hired a professional. Now how about that photograph?" Henry took the shot, the shutter clicking with mechanical precision. But even as he worked, his eyes kept drifting back to that spot in the dirt. Whatever he'd seen through his camera lens felt important, significant in a way he couldn't explain. They moved around the construction site for the next hour, with Henry documenting the massive earth-moving operation. Bulldozers carved through orange groves that had stood for decades, their steel blades slicing through roots that had grown deep into California soil. Workers hauled away tons of earth, exposing layers of sediment that hadn't seen sunlight in generations. "Tell me about this land, Walt," Henry said as he changed film. "What was here before you bought it?" "Orange groves mostly. Some farmland. The Hartwell family owned most of it until the 1940s, but they sold it to a development company that couldn't get financing. We picked it up for a good price." Walt gestured toward the horizon. "Perfect location, close enough to Los Angeles for families to visit, but far enough out that we could afford the acreage we needed." "The Hartwells, were they local folks?" "I believe so. Old California family. Been here since before the turn of the century." "Why do you ask?" Henry lowered his camera. Something about the name Hartwell stirred a memory, though he couldn't quite place it. "Just curious about the history. Sometimes it helps me understand what I'm photographing." As they walked between the construction equipment, Henry noticed something that made his blood run cold. Near every major excavation site, partially buried in the disturbed earth, were more fragments. A tiny shoe here, a scrap of faded fabric there, pieces of what looked like old toys and personal belongings. But just like the doll head, they seemed to be visible only through his camera lens. He snapped photographs continuously, documenting not just the construction, but these strange artifacts that seemed to be emerging from the soil. Each click of the shutter felt like he was collecting evidence of something terrible, though he couldn't say what. "Quite a photographer you've got there," commented Bill, the construction foreman, as he approached Walt. "Been taking pictures of dirt clods for the past 10 minutes. Walt glanced at Henry with concern. "Everything all right? You seem distracted." Henry forced a smile. "Just being thorough. You never know which shots will end up being important." But privately, his mind was racing. During the war, he'd learned to trust his instincts when something felt wrong. Right now, every instinct he possessed was screaming that this land held secrets, dark ones that were fighting to surface as the bulldozers tore away decades of concealment. As the morning wore on, Henry found himself paying more attention to the workers' conversations. Most were focused on the job at hand, but he caught fragments of something else. Muttered complaints about equipment malfunctions, tools that went missing only to turn up in strange places, and an unusual number of accidents since construction had begun. "Lost 3 good men just this week," he heard one worker tell another. "Johnson swears something grabbed his ankle when he was working near the old foundation, pulled him right into that drainage ditch." "Foundations?" Henry interrupted. "There were buildings here before." The worker, a weathered man with calloused hands, nodded grimly. "Old farmhouse been gone for years. We're supposed to clear out all the debris before the real construction starts. But every time we think we've got it all, more stuff turns up." Henry's grip tightened on his camera. "What kind of stuff?" "Personal things, mostly. Old bottles, pieces of furniture, children's toys." The worker's voice dropped to almost a whisper. "Found a whole nursery's worth of stuff yesterday. Cribs, rocking horses, dolls. Weird thing is, it all looked brand new, like it had been preserved somehow." The pieces were starting to come together in Henry's mind, forming a picture he didn't like. This wasn't just about documenting construction progress anymore. Something had happened on this land, something connected to the Hartwell family and the fragments he was seeing through his camera. As Walt called him over for another round of photographs, Henry made a decision. Tonight, after the workday ended, he would return to this site alone. Whatever secrets this land was trying to reveal, he was going to uncover them. Even if Walt Disney couldn't see what was right in front of his feet, Henry's camera never lied. Henry waited until well past midnight before returning to the construction site. The October air had turned cold, carrying with it the scent of disturbed earth and dying orange blossoms. His Ford's headlights cut through the darkness as he navigated the dirt roads that the bulldozers had carved through what had once been pristine farmland. The construction site looked entirely different at night. The massive equipment stood silent and imposing, their metal surfaces gleaming dully in the moonlight like sleeping giants. Without the noise and activity of the day shift, the place felt abandoned, forgotten, as if the workers had fled from something they couldn't name. Henry parked at the edge of the site and gathered his equipment. Along with his camera, he'd brought a powerful flashlight, extra batteries, and a small camping shovel he'd picked up at a hardware store on the drive back to Los Angeles. If there were artifacts buried in this soil, he was going to find them. The silence was oppressive as he walked across the torn earth. During the day, the constant rumble of machinery had masked other sounds, but now he could hear everything: the distant hum of traffic on Harbor Boulevard, the rustle of small animals in the remaining orange trees, and something else. A sound so faint he almost missed it. Singing, a child's voice, high and sweet, drifting across the construction site like smoke. Henry stopped walking and listened intently, trying to pinpoint the source. The melody was familiar, something from his own childhood, but he couldn't quite place it. As he stood motionless in the darkness, the singing grew slightly louder, seeming to come from the area where he'd photographed Walt Disney earlier that day. Henry clicked on his flashlight and approached cautiously. The beam illuminated piles of excavated earth, abandoned tools, and the deep gouges left by bulldozer treads. But as he swept the light across the ground, searching for the doll head he'd seen through his camera, something else caught his attention. Footprints in the soft dirt, small ones, like those of a child, leading from the excavation site toward the remaining orange grove. The prints were bare with delicate toe marks pressed into the soil, and they looked fresh, so fresh that they couldn't have been made during the day shift. The singing stopped abruptly, as if the child had suddenly realized she was being watched. Henry's combat instincts kicked in. During the war, silence was often more dangerous than noise. It meant the enemy was close, watching, waiting. He turned off his flashlight and let his eyes adjust to the moonlight, then followed the footprints as quietly as possible. The trail led him away from the construction area and into the grove of orange trees that had been marked for removal. Here the air was thick with the scent of citrus blossoms and something else, something sweet and cloying that reminded him uncomfortably of funeral flowers. The footprints became harder to follow in the grass between the trees, but Henry pressed on, guided by an instinct he couldn't explain. Deep in the grove he found what he was looking for. The foundation of an old house rose from the earth like broken teeth, its concrete walls cracked and stained with age. Weeds grew through gaps in the structure, and wild vines had claimed most of the ruins, but Henry could still make out the basic layout. A large farmhouse, with what had probably been a wraparound porch and multiple bedrooms. This had to be the Hartwell family home. Henry switched his flashlight back on and explored the ruins carefully. Most of the wooden structure had long since rotted away, leaving only the concrete foundation and a few scattered pieces of debris. But in what had once been the cellar, his light revealed something that made his heart race. A child's bedroom preserved as if frozen in time. The small space had been protected from the elements by a partially collapsed floor above, creating a pocket of dry air that had kept everything intact. A small iron bed frame held a mattress that, while faded and dusty, showed no signs of decay. Toys were scattered across the floor, a rocking horse, building blocks, several dolls in various states of dress, and on a small wooden shelf, Henry saw dozens of books, their spines still readable in his flashlight beam. But it was the photographs on the walls that made him catch his breath. Family portraits in cracked frames showed a man and woman with warm smiles, standing behind a little girl with blonde ringlets and bright, intelligent eyes. The child appeared to be about 6 or 7 years old, wearing a white dress with lace trim and holding a porcelain doll that looked exactly like the head Henry had seen buried in the construction site. Under one of the photographs, someone had written in careful script, "Emma Hartwell, age 7, October 1923. Henry's hands trembled as he took photograph after photograph of the preserved room. Through his camera lens, the space seemed to come alive. He could almost see the little girl playing with her toys, reading her books, sleeping peacefully in the small bed. But there was something else in the photographs, something that made his blood run cold. In every shot he took, there was a shadow in the corner of the room, a small figure in a white dress, watching him with eyes that seemed far too old for such a young face. He lowered the camera and looked at the corner directly. Nothing there but darkness and dust. But when he raised the camera again, she was closer. Henry's rational mind told him to leave, to get back to his car and drive away from this place as fast as possible. But his photographer's instincts, honed by years of documenting the truth even when it was terrible, kept him shooting. Whatever was happening here, whatever had happened to Emma Hartwell, deserved to be witnessed and recorded. The shadow girl moved closer with each photograph, until Henry could see her clearly through his viewfinder. She was beautiful and terrible at the same time, her blonde hair hanging in perfect ringlets, her white dress pristine despite decades in the ground, her blue eyes filled with a sadness so profound it seemed to pull at his very soul. But it was her mouth that terrified him most. Her lips were moving, forming words he couldn't hear, over and over, with increasing urgency. Henry tried to read her lips, tried to understand what she was desperately trying to tell him. Then, with a shock of recognition, he realized what she was saying. "Find me, find me, find me." The flashlight flickered and went out, plunging him into absolute darkness. In the silence that followed, Henry heard something that made every hair on his body stand up. The sound of a child sobbing, heartbroken and lost, echoing up from somewhere deep beneath the earth. Henry barely slept that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Emma Hartwell's desperate face pleading with him through his camera lens, her lips forming those two terrible words over and over, "Find me." By dawn, he'd consumed an entire pot of coffee and chain-smoked half a pack of Lucky Strikes while pacing around his cramped apartment. The photographs he'd developed in his makeshift darkroom told a story that defied rational explanation. Shot after shot showed the preserved bedroom in perfect detail, but in every single frame, Emma's ghostly figure grew progressively closer to the camera. In the final photograph, she was reaching directly toward the lens, her small hand seeming to push through the barrier between her world and his. But it was the expression on her face in that last shot that haunted him most. Not anger or malevolence, but pure desperation. The look of a child who had been lost for 31 years and was running out of hope that anyone would ever find her. Henry knew he needed answers, and there was only one place in Los Angeles where he could find the kind of historical records he needed. The Los Angeles Public Library's central branch downtown had one of the most comprehensive newspaper archives on the West Coast. If something had happened to Emma Hartwell in 1923, it would have been reported. The massive library building on 5th Street was a testament to the city's growing importance, its Art Deco facade rising 8 stories above the bustling downtown streets. Henry climbed the marble steps 2 at a time, his camera bag bouncing against his hip. Inside, the cool, hushed atmosphere was a welcome relief from the October heat that was already building outside. "I need to access newspaper archives from 1923, he told the librarian at the reference desk. A middle-aged woman with wire-rimmed glasses and graying hair pulled back in a severe bun. "Specific date range?" she asked, not looking up from her cataloging work. "October through December. I'm looking for anything about the Hartwell family in Anaheim, particularly involving a missing child. That got her attention. She looked up sharply, studying his face with new interest. Missing child cases from 1923? That's quite specific. Are you a journalist? Photographer. I'm working on a project about land development in Orange County, and the Hartwell property came up. I want to understand the history of the area. The librarian, whose nameplate read Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, led him to a basement room lined with filing cabinets and microfilm readers. The air down here was thick with the smell of old paper and preservation chemicals, reminding Henry uncomfortably of the morgues he'd visited during the war. The Los Angeles Times and the Anaheim Gazette both covered Orange County extensively during that period, Mrs. Patterson explained, as she pulled out several boxes of microfilm. If there was a missing child case involving a prominent family like the Hartwells, it would have been front-page news. Henry threaded the first roll of film into the reader and began scrolling through October 1923. The headlines were typical for the era: prohibition enforcement raids, real estate booms, Hollywood scandals. But on October 15th, he found what he was looking for. "Prominent Anaheim family's daughter vanishes," screamed the headline across the front page of the Anaheim Gazette. Below it, a photograph showed the same family Henry had seen in Emma's bedroom. Thomas and Margaret Hartwell standing beside their beautiful 7-year-old daughter. Henry read the article with growing horror. Local authorities are baffled by the mysterious disappearance of Emma Rose Hartwell, daughter of prominent citrus grower Thomas Hartwell and his wife Margaret. The child vanished from the family's 200-acre ranch on Harbor Boulevard sometime during the night of October 13th, leaving behind no trace save for her beloved doll, found abandoned in the orange grove behind the family home. Sheriff's deputies have conducted an extensive search of the property and surrounding areas, but have found no evidence of foul play or indication of the child's whereabouts. The Hartwell family has offered a substantial reward for any information leading to Emma's safe return. "She was the light of our lives," said a distraught Margaret Hartwell. "Emma loved those orange trees, loved to play among them with her dolls. She knew every inch of our property. She would never have wandered off alone." The child's disappearance has shocked the close-knit Anaheim community, where the Hartwell family has been prominent in civic affairs for over 2 decades. Henry continued scrolling through the subsequent weeks, following the story as it developed. Search parties combed the orange groves. Bloodhounds were brought in from Los Angeles. Private investigators were hired. But as the days turned to weeks and weeks to months, the coverage grew smaller and less hopeful. The final article he found was dated December 20th, 1923. Hartwell search called off after 2 months. After an exhaustive search spanning 9 weeks, authorities have officially suspended the investigation into the disappearance of 7-year-old Emma Hartwell. Sheriff Samuel Morrison announced that all available resources have been exhausted and that the case will remain open but inactive unless new evidence emerges. The child's parents, Thomas and Margaret Hartwell, have announced their intention to leave Anaheim permanently. "We cannot bear to remain on the property where our darling Emma vanished," Margaret Hartwell told this reporter. "Every tree, every shadow reminds us of our loss. We will sell the ranch and begin a new life elsewhere, though our hearts will forever remain with our missing daughter." The Hartwell property, valued at over $50,000, is expected to be sold to developers within the coming months. Henry sat back in his chair, his mind racing. Emma Hartwell had vanished without a trace from the exact spot where Walt Disney was now building his theme park. Her body had never been found, her fate never determined, and now, 31 years later, she was trying to communicate through his camera, begging him to find her. But find her where? The construction crews had been excavating the site for weeks. If Emma's body had been buried somewhere on the property, surely they would have discovered it by now, unless it was buried deeper than anyone had thought to look. Henry made photocopies of every article he could find about the case, then spent another hour searching for any follow-up stories. What he discovered made the mystery even more disturbing. In the months following Emma's disappearance, 3 other children had vanished from farms in the area. All young girls between the ages of 6 and 8, all last seen playing near orange groves. None of them had ever been found. As Henry walked back to his car, squinting in the afternoon sun, a terrible possibility began to form in his mind. What if Emma Hartwell's disappearance hadn't been an isolated incident? What if something predatory had been stalking children in the orange groves of Anaheim during that autumn of 1923? And what if that same something was still there, buried beneath the earth, where Walt Disney planned to build a place for children to play and laugh and create happy memories? Henry drove back toward Anaheim with his photographs and newspaper clippings spread across the passenger seat. Pieces of a puzzle. That was becoming more horrifying with each new discovery. Emma wasn't just asking him to find her. She was warning him about something far worse than a single missing child. She was trying to tell him about the others. Henry arrived at the Disney construction site the next morning with his camera bag and a manila folder containing photocopies of every newspaper article about Emma Hartwell's disappearance. The October sun was already beating down mercilessly on the torn earth, and the air shimmered with heat waves rising from the metal surfaces of the bulldozers and excavators. Walt Disney was exactly where Henry expected to find him, standing near the center of the construction zone, gesturing animatedly as he explained his vision to a group of men in expensive suits. These had to be the investors Walt had mentioned, the money men who were funding his ambitious dream of a family theme park. "The castle will go right here," Walt was saying, pointing toward a section of cleared land, visible from every corner of the park, a beacon of magic and wonder. "And over there, we'll have a steamboat ride through carefully landscaped rivers and caves." Henry waited at the edge of the group, his hands gripping the folder so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. How do you tell a man that his dream project is being built on what might be a mass grave? How do you explain that the magical kingdom he envisions could be cursed by the restless spirits of murdered children? "Ah, Henry," Walt noticed him and waved him over. "Gentlemen, this is the photographer I was telling you about. He's documenting our progress for posterity." The investors nodded politely, but Henry could see the skepticism in their eyes. They were businessmen, concerned with profit margins and return on investment, not artistic vision or historical documentation. One of them, a heavy-set man with a gold watch chain, looked particularly dubious. "Mr. Disney," the man said, mopping his brow with a silk handkerchief, "I have to ask again about the delays we've been experiencing. My sources tell me you've had an unusual number of equipment failures and worker injuries since breaking ground." Walt's smile never wavered, but Henry caught a flicker of irritation in his eyes. "Construction is always unpredictable, Mr. Hoffman. We're building something that's never been attempted before, a completely immersive entertainment experience. There are bound to be challenges." "Challenges are one thing," another investor chimed in, "but 7 accidents in 3 weeks? Workers claiming their equipment is being sabotaged? Some of the men are starting to talk about the place being cursed." Henry stepped forward before Walt could respond. "Actually, there might be something to that." The group turned to stare at him, and Henry felt his mouth go dry. But Emma's desperate face flashed in his mind, and he forced himself to continue. "I've been researching the history of this land. There are some things you need to know before construction continues." Walt's expression hardened. "Henry, I'm sure our investors aren't interested in local folklore." "This isn't folklore." Henry opened the manila folder and pulled out the newspaper clippings. In October of 1923, a 7-year-old girl named Emma Hartwell disappeared from this exact property. Her body was never found, and she wasn't the only one. 3 other children vanished from nearby farms that same autumn. The investors exchanged uncomfortable glances. Mr. Hoffman took the newspaper clippings and examined them closely, his face growing paler with each article he read. "Mr. Disney," Hoffman said slowly, "were you aware of this history when you purchased the land?" Walt's jaw tightened. "Ancient history, gentlemen. Tragic, certainly, but irrelevant to our project. This land has been dormant for 30 years. We're bringing it back to life, creating something positive and beautiful." "But what if the children are still here?" Henry pressed. "What if their bodies are buried somewhere on the property? Construction crews have been finding artifacts, toys, clothing, personal items. What if they're not just remnants of old farm life? What if they're evidence of—" "That's enough." Walt's voice was sharp, cutting through Henry's words like a blade. "I won't have you spreading superstitious nonsense that could derail this entire project. You were hired to take photographs, not conduct amateur investigations." But the damage was already done. Henry could see the doubt creeping into the investors' faces, the way they were looking around the construction site with new eyes. Hoffman was still studying the newspaper articles, his expression growing more troubled by the moment. "Perhaps we should postpone any major excavation until we can bring in some archaeological experts," suggested another investor, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses. "If there's even a possibility that human remains might be discovered." "Archaeological experts?" Walt's laugh was strained. "Gentlemen, we're talking about a few missing children from 30 years ago. Even if there were remains on this property, which there aren't, We would handle the situation with complete discretion and respect, but I assure you, we found nothing that would suggest—" He was interrupted by a commotion from across the construction site. Workers were shouting, and Henry could see several men gathered around one of the excavators, pointing at something in the freshly dug earth. "Boss!" called Bill, the construction foreman, jogging toward them with his face pale and drawn. "We need you to see this. We found something in the southeast section about 6 feet down." Walt's confident expression faltered for the first time. "What kind of something?" "Human remains, sir. Small ones. Looks like a child." The silence that followed was deafening. Henry felt his heart pounding as he watched Walt's dream begin to crumble around him. The investors were already backing away, murmuring among themselves about liability and bad publicity. "There must be some mistake," Walt said weakly. "It's probably just old farm equipment or animal bones or—" "It's a child, Mr. Disney." Bill's voice was firm, still wearing what's left of a dress. "And, sir, there's something else. We found her clutching a doll, little porcelain thing with blonde hair." Henry's blood turned to ice. Through his peripheral vision, he caught a glimpse of movement near the excavation site. A small figure in white, visible only for an instant before disappearing behind one of the bulldozers. Emma was there watching, waiting to see if the adults would finally listen to what she'd been trying to tell them. "I'm calling the police," Hoffman announced, pulling out his cell phone. "This entire operation needs to be shut down until the authorities can conduct a proper investigation." Walt looked around desperately, his eyes finally meeting Henry's. For a moment, the confident visionary was gone, replaced by a man who was beginning to understand that his magical kingdom was being built on ground soaked with old blood and tears. "Henry," Walt said quietly, his voice barely audible over the growing chaos of workers and concerned investors. "What else did you find in your research?" Henry looked at the newspaper clippings scattered in Hoffman's hands, at the workers gathered around their grisly discovery, at the construction site that had suddenly become a crime scene. Emma Hartwell had been trying to tell him this would happen. She'd been trying to warn him that she wasn't alone down there in the dark earth. "I found 3 other missing children," he said. "All disappeared within 2 months of Emma. All from properties within 5 miles of here." Walt closed his eyes and took a shuddering breath. When he opened them again, Henry saw the exact moment when Walt Disney realized that his dream of creating the happiest place on Earth might have inadvertently become something else entirely, a place where nightmares came true. Within 2 hours, the construction site had been transformed into a crime scene. Police cars lined Harbor Boulevard, their red and blue lights casting eerie shadows across the orange groves. Yellow tape fluttered in the warm October breeze, sectioning off areas where investigators in white coveralls worked with brushes and trowels, treating the earth like an archaeological dig. Detective Ray Castellanos of the Orange County Sheriff's Department stood near the excavation site, smoking a cigarette and studying the small skeleton that had been carefully exposed in the soil. He was a weathered man in his 50s, with graying hair and the tired eyes of someone who had seen too much human cruelty over the years. "How long you been taking pictures of dead bodies, son?" he asked Henry, who was documenting the scene at the detective's request. 3 years in Korea, Henry replied, adjusting his camera settings for the harsh afternoon light. "But this is different. Those were soldiers. This is a child. Child who's been dead for 30 years, according to your newspaper research." Castellanos flicked his cigarette butt into the dirt. "Coroner's preliminary examination confirms she's been in the ground a long time. Probably matches your time frame." Henry lowered his camera and studied the skeleton. Even after 3 decades in the soil, it was heartbreakingly small. The remains of a white dress clung to the tiny bones, and clutched in the skeletal fingers was indeed a porcelain doll head, the same one Henry had first seen through his camera lens, though now it was cracked and stained with age. "Detective, there's something else you need to know." Henry pulled out his folder of newspaper clippings. Emma Hartwell wasn't the only child who disappeared from this area in 1923. There were 3 others within a 2-month period. Castellanos took the articles and read them quickly, his expression growing more grim with each page. Mary Sullivan, age 6, vanished from a farm 2 miles north. Patricia Chen, age 7, disappeared from the neighboring property. Susan Martinez, age 8, last seen playing in the orange groves behind her family's house. He looked up at Henry. "You think they're all buried here? I think someone was hunting children in these orange groves 30 years ago. Someone who knew the area well enough to dispose of bodies where they wouldn't be found. Until now." Castellanos gestured toward the construction equipment that stood silent and abandoned around the crime scene. Disney's bulldozers dug deeper than anyone had in decades. Walt Disney sat in his black Cadillac at the edge of the crime scene, his head in his hands. The investors had fled hours ago, taking their money and their confidence with them. The dream of a magical kingdom in Anaheim was crumbling before his eyes, replaced by a nightmare that threatened to destroy everything he'd worked toward. Henry approached the car cautiously. Through the window, he could see that Walt had aged years in just a few hours. The enthusiastic visionary was gone, replaced by a broken man confronting the possibility that his life's work might be built on a foundation of murdered children. "They're calling off the project," Walt said without looking up. "The investors, the construction crews, everyone. They're all terrified that this place is cursed." "Maybe it is," Henry replied quietly. Walt finally raised his head, his eyes red-rimmed and exhausted. "You knew, didn't you? When you saw that doll head yesterday, you knew we were going to find something like this." Henry thought about Emma's ghostly figure, about her desperate plea to find her. "I suspected. The land was trying to tell us something. We just weren't listening. What am I supposed to do now?" Walt's voice was barely a whisper. "I've invested everything in this project. My reputation, my family's future, every dollar I could borrow. And now..." Before Henry could answer, Detective Castellanos appeared at the car window. "Mr. Disney, I need to ask you some questions about the land purchase. We're trying to establish a timeline of who had access to this property over the past 30 years. As Walt reluctantly climbed out of the car to speak with the detective, Henry noticed something that made his blood run cold. Near the excavation site, just at the edge of his vision, he caught a glimpse of movement. Not just Emma this time, but other small figures, translucent children in old-fashioned clothes, watching the investigation with hollow, accusing eyes. He raised his camera quickly, but by the time he looked through the viewfinder, they were gone. Yet somehow he knew they were still there, waiting for justice that had been delayed for 3 decades. The coroner's van arrived as the sun began to set, its headlights cutting through the gathering dusk. Dr. Margaret Pierce, the county medical examiner, was a no-nonsense woman who had examined thousands of bodies during her career. But even she seemed shaken as she studied Emma's remains. "This child didn't die naturally," she told Detective Castellanos in a voice meant to be private, though Henry overheard from his position nearby. "There are clear signs of trauma to the skull, and the way the body was positioned, curled up with the doll, someone took care in burying her. This wasn't random violence." "Someone who cared about her?" Castellanos asked. "Or someone who felt guilty about what they'd done?" Dr. Pierce pulled off her latex gloves with a sharp snap. "I'll know more after a full autopsy, but my preliminary assessment is that this child was murdered by someone she trusted, someone who had access to her, who could get close without raising alarm." Henry felt sick to his stomach. The image of Emma playing innocently in the orange groves, unaware that someone was watching her, planning to hurt her, was almost too horrible to bear. And if Dr. Pierce was right about there being other bodies... "Detective," called one of the investigators from across the site, "we've got something else here. Ground-penetrating radar is showing more anomalies about 50 yards north of the first burial site." Castellanos cursed under his breath. "How many more?" "Could be 3, maybe 4. Hard to tell without excavation." The detective turned to Henry with a look of grim determination. "Looks like you were right about those other missing children. We're going to be here for weeks, maybe months, turning this entire property into an archaeological dig." As if summoned by his words, the ghostly children appeared again at the edge of Henry's vision. Emma stood closest to him, her blue eyes no longer desperate, but somehow peaceful, as if she finally understood that someone was listening to her story. Behind her, 3 other little girls watched silently, patiently, as if they'd been waiting 30 years for this moment. Henry raised his camera one more time, and for just an instant, he saw them clearly through the lens. 4 children who had been stolen from their families, buried in unmarked graves, and forgotten by everyone except the orange trees that had grown over their resting place. But they weren't forgotten anymore. Whatever evil had taken their lives was about to be exposed, dragged into the light after 3 decades of darkness. And somehow Henry knew that Emma and the others wouldn't rest until justice was served. The happiest place on earth would have to wait. First, Anaheim had to confront its darkest secret. 3 days into the excavation, Detective Castellanos had confirmed the worst fears. 4 small skeletons had been recovered from the Hartwell property, each buried with the same careful attention to placement, and each accompanied by a cherished toy or personal item. Emma with her porcelain doll, Mary Sullivan with a small wooden horse, Patricia Chen with a silk ribbon, and Susan Martinez with a tiny silver cross. Henry had documented every stage of the recovery, his camera capturing images that would haunt him for the rest of his life. But it was the photograph he took on the third evening that changed everything. He was alone at the site, having stayed late to photograph the excavation areas in the golden hour light that Walt Disney had originally wanted for his progress documentation. The irony wasn't lost on him. Instead of capturing the birth of a magical kingdom, he was documenting the unearthing of a decades-old mass grave. Through his camera lens, he saw them again, the four ghostly children standing at the edge of the excavation sites like mourners at their own funeral. But this time, there was a fifth figure with them, an elderly woman in a faded house dress, her grey hair pulled back in a bun, her weathered face etched with lines of grief and guilt. Henry lowered the camera, and the woman remained visible. She was real. "You're the photographer," she said, her voice carrying a slight tremor of age. "The one who found Emma." Henry nodded, not trusting his voice. The woman looked to be in her 70s, with the stooped posture and careful movements of someone who had carried a heavy burden for far too long. "My name is Rose Chen," she continued. "Patricia was my younger sister." Henry felt his heart skip a beat. "Your sister? Patricia Chen? One of the missing children?" The old woman's eyes filled with tears. "Patty was 7 when she disappeared. I was 12, old enough to know more than I told the police back then. Old enough to be too scared to speak up." She walked slowly toward the excavation site where Patricia's remains had been found, her movements careful and deliberate. Henry followed, his camera hanging forgotten around his neck. "I saw who took her," Rose whispered. "I saw him, and I never told anyone because he threatened to kill me and my parents if I said a word. For 60 years I've lived with that secret, watching him become a pillar of the community while my baby sister rotted in the ground." Henry's mind raced. If Rose Chen had witnessed her sister's abduction, if the killer was someone who became prominent in the community, then this wasn't just about solving a cold case. This was about exposing someone who had been living freely for decades while 4 families never knew what happened to their children. "Who was it?" Henry asked. "Who took Patricia?" Rose Chen turned to face him, and in her eyes he saw the reflection of a terrified 12-year-old girl who had made an impossible choice between her own survival and justice for her sister. "Arthur Morrison," she said. "Sheriff Sam Morrison's son. He was 18 in 1923, home from college for the harvest season. He worked for several of the local farms, including ours and the Hartwells. He had access to all these properties, knew where the children played, knew the schedules of their families." The name hit Henry like a physical blow. Morrison. He'd seen that name in the newspaper articles. Sheriff Samuel Morrison, the man who had led the investigation into Emma Hartwell's disappearance. The man who had called off the search after 9 weeks, declaring that all available resources had been exhausted. The sheriff's own son, Henry breathed. That's why the investigation was abandoned. That's why no connection was ever made between the missing children. Sheriff Morrison knew, Rose continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. Maybe not at first, but he figured it out, and he chose to protect his son instead of getting justice for our girls. Arthur moved away right after the last disappearance, went to San Francisco. The sheriff told everyone he was starting a new job, but I think he was really running from what he'd done. Henry pulled out his notebook, his hands shaking as he tried to write down everything Rose was telling him. "Is Arthur Morrison still alive?" "Far as I know. Last I heard, he was living in San Francisco, running some kind of business, married, had children of his own, living a normal life while our girls stayed buried in the ground." The implications were staggering. If Arthur Morrison was still alive, if he could be found and confronted with the evidence that had been uncovered, then the families of the 4 murdered children might finally get the closure they'd been denied for 3 decades. But it would also mean exposing the corruption of an entire police investigation, revealing that the sheriff himself had been complicit in covering up his son's crimes. "Why are you telling me this now?" Henry asked. "Why didn't you come forward when the bodies were discovered?" Rose Chen looked toward the excavation sites, where small American flags now marked each grave. "Because I'm 73 years old, and I won't live much longer. Because I've spent 60 years being afraid, and I'm tired of being afraid. And because—" She paused, looking directly at Henry. "Because Patty came to me in a dream 3 nights ago. She told me it was time to tell the truth." Henry felt a chill run down his spine. The ghostly children weren't just appearing to him. They were reaching out to anyone who might help them find justice, even after all these years. "Will you testify?" he asked. "Will you tell Detective Castellanos what you just told me?" "I'll tell him everything," Rose replied firmly. "Where I saw Arthur Morrison grab Patty, how he put his hand over her mouth and carried her toward the orange grove, how he came back 2 hours later without her, his clothes dirty and his eyes wild, how he saw me watching and threatened to kill my whole family if I ever said a word about it. As if summoned by her words, Detective Castellanos appeared at the edge of the construction site, his police cruiser pulling up just as the last light was fading from the sky. Henry waved him over, his mind already racing with the implications of Rose Chen's testimony. This was no longer just about finding the bodies of 4 murdered children. This was about exposing a conspiracy that had allowed a killer to walk free for 60 years, while grieving families were told their children had simply vanished into thin air. And somewhere in San Francisco, Arthur Morrison was living his life, unaware that the ground was finally about to give up its secrets and that justice, long delayed, was finally coming for him. As Detective Castellanos approached, Henry caught one last glimpse of the ghostly children through his camera lens. This time they weren't pleading or desperate. This time they looked hopeful, as if they finally believed that their long wait might soon be over. Detective Castellanos listened to Rose Chen's testimony with the focused intensity of a man who had just been handed the key to solving the most disturbing case of his career. Henry watched the detective's face as Rose recounted every detail of that terrible day in October 1923, from Arthur Morrison's predatory smile to the way her sister's small hand had reached desperately toward her as she was carried away into the orange grove. "Mrs. Chen," Castellanos said when she finished, "you understand that what you're describing is not just murder, but a conspiracy involving the sheriff's department itself. Sheriff Morrison would have had the authority to suppress evidence, redirect the investigation, even destroy records if necessary." Rose nodded, her weathered hands trembling slightly. "I was just a child then, Detective. All I knew was that a man had threatened to kill my family if I spoke up. My parents were Chinese immigrants, still struggling to establish themselves here. We had no power, no influence. Who would have believed us against the sheriff's son?" Henry understood the horrible calculation that Rose's family had been forced to make. In 1923, Chinese immigrants faced widespread discrimination and suspicion. Even if they had come forward with their daughter's testimony, it would have been their word against one of the most prominent families in Orange County. "I need to know everything you can remember about Arthur Morrison," Castellanos continued. "Physical description, habits, where he lived, who he associated with, anything that might help us track him down. He was tall, maybe 6 feet, with brown hair and green eyes, strong from farm work, but there was something wrong with the way he looked at children, like they were toys to him." Rose's voice dropped to a whisper. "After Patty disappeared, I started watching him more carefully. I saw him following other little girls, standing just at the edge of properties where families had young daughters. He was hunting, Detective, choosing his victims." Henry felt sick to his stomach. The image of Arthur Morrison stalking children through the orange groves, selecting his next victim while wearing the protection of his father's badge, was almost too horrific to contemplate. "What happened after Susan Martinez disappeared?" Castellanos asked. "That was the last case in your timeline. Arthur left for San Francisco within a week," Rose replied. "Sheriff Morrison said he'd gotten a job opportunity, but I think the truth was that people were starting to get suspicious. 4 children vanishing from neighboring farms was too much of a coincidence, even for 1923. Arthur needed to disappear before someone made the connection." Castellanos pulled out his notebook and began writing rapidly. "San Francisco is a big city, especially 60 years ago. But if Arthur Morrison is still alive, he'll have left traces. Employment records, tax documents, maybe marriage and birth certificates if he started a family." "Detective," Henry interrupted, "there's something else you need to know. I've been photographing the excavation sites, and through my camera lens, I've been seeing things. The children, their spirits. They've been trying to communicate, trying to tell us what happened to them." Castellanos looked at Henry with a mixture of skepticism and concern. "Son, I've seen a lot of strange things in 30 years of police work, but ghost photography isn't exactly admissible evidence in court." "I'm not talking about evidence for trial," Henry said quickly. "I'm talking about guidance. These children have been waiting 60 years for someone to listen to their story. Maybe they can help us find Arthur Morrison." Before Castellanos could respond, they were interrupted by the arrival of another police car. A young officer got out and jogged toward them, his face flushed with excitement. "Detective, we just got a call from the Los Angeles Times. They want to run a front-page story about the discovery tomorrow morning. Disneyland built on children's graves is their proposed headline." Castellanos cursed under his breath. That's all we need. Once this story breaks nationally, we'll have reporters crawling all over the crime scene, and Arthur Morrison will know we're looking for him. Henry had a sudden inspiration. What if that's exactly what we want? What if we let the story run, but we control the narrative? Use the media attention to flush Morrison out of hiding? How do you mean? We release Rose's testimony to the press. We name Arthur Morrison as the suspect and ask for public assistance in locating him. After 60 years, he probably thinks he's safe, that his crimes are buried and forgotten. But when his name hits the front page of newspapers across the country, someone will recognize him. Someone will know where he is. Rose Chen nodded slowly. Patty and the other girls deserve to have their story told, and Arthur Morrison deserves to face justice for what he did, even if it's 60 years late. Castellanos considered this for a moment, weighing the risks against the potential benefits. It could work, he admitted. Morrison is probably in his 70s now if he's still alive. He might be careless, might not expect anyone to still be looking for him after all this time. There's something else, Henry added. Walt Disney has been destroyed by this discovery. His investors have pulled out. His dream project is finished. But what if we could give him a chance to help catch the man who murdered these children? What if Disney's name and influence could help ensure that this story gets maximum national coverage? The idea was audacious, but Henry could see it taking shape in his mind. Walt Disney's involvement would guarantee that the story received attention far beyond Orange County or even California. The name Disney carried weight across the entire country, and if Walt publicly called for justice for the murdered children, it would be impossible for Arthur Morrison to hide. I'll talk to Mr. Disney, Castellanos decided, and I'll contact the San Francisco Police Department, see if they can start searching their records for any trace of Arthur Morrison. Mrs. Chen, I'll need you to come to the station tomorrow morning to give a formal statement. As the detective prepared to leave, Henry noticed movement at the edge of the excavation site. The ghostly children were there again, but this time they seemed different, less desperate, more determined. Emma stepped forward, her translucent figure more solid than Henry had ever seen it before, and for just a moment he could have sworn he heard her voice carried on the evening breeze. Find him, make him pay. The hunt for Arthur Morrison was about to begin, and Henry had the strangest feeling that they wouldn't be searching alone. The spirits of 4 murdered children would be guiding them every step of the way, refusing to rest until justice was finally served. After 60 years of silence, the dead were finally ready to speak. The Los Angeles Times headline screamed across newspaper stands throughout California on Friday morning, "Disney's dream becomes nightmare. Children's bodies found at Anaheim construction site." But it was the sub-headline that sent shockwaves across the nation. 60-year-old murder case reopened. Sheriff's son named as suspect. Henry stood outside the newspaper building on Spring Street, watching people stop to read the headlines with expressions of horror and disbelief. The story had everything that captured the public imagination: Hollywood dreams destroyed, murdered children, police corruption, and the supernatural elements that Henry's photographs seemed to suggest. Walt Disney had surprised everyone by agreeing to cooperate fully with the media campaign. Rather than hiding from the scandal that had destroyed his theme park project, he had chosen to use his celebrity status to ensure maximum coverage for the search for Arthur Morrison. If these children were murdered on land that I purchased, then I have a moral obligation to see that their killer faces justice, Walt had told reporters the previous evening. The dream of Disneyland can wait. Right now, the only thing that matters is giving these families the answers they've been denied for 60 years. Henry's photographs were prominently featured in the newspaper coverage. Images of the excavation sites, the recovered remains, and most controversially, the shots he claimed showed the ghostly figures of the murdered children. While skeptics dismissed these as photographic anomalies or outright hoaxes, they added an element of supernatural intrigue that kept the story on front pages across the country. Detective Castellanos had set up a command post at the Orange County Sheriff's Department, fielding calls from law enforcement agencies, journalists, and members of the public who claimed to have information about Arthur Morrison's whereabouts. By noon, they had received over 200 tips, ranging from credible sightings to wild conspiracy theories. San Francisco PD has been extremely cooperative, Castellanos told Henry as they reviewed the incoming leads. They've found employment records showing that Arthur Morrison worked as a warehouse supervisor for Pacific Shipping Company from 1924 to 1962. He retired with a full pension and a clean employment record. Any criminal activity during that time? Nothing official, but I spoke to a retired SFPD detective who remembered Morrison's name coming up in connection with several missing children cases during the 1930s and 1940s. Never enough evidence to make an arrest, but enough to keep him on their radar. Henry felt a chill of recognition. He didn't stop killing when he moved to San Francisco. He just got better at hiding it. That's what I'm afraid of. Morrison may have been responsible for far more deaths than just the 4 children we found in Anaheim, but here's the interesting part. According to Social Security records, Arthur Morrison is very much alive. He's 78 years old and receiving retirement benefits at an address in Daly City, just south of San Francisco. The breakthrough they'd been hoping for had arrived faster than anyone expected. After 60 years of freedom, Arthur Morrison was about to discover that his past had finally caught up with him. "We need to move carefully," Castellanos continued. "Morrison has lived under the radar for decades. If he realizes we're closing in, he might run again. Or worse, he might decide to eliminate any remaining evidence. What kind of evidence could still exist after all this time? Trophies. Serial killers often keep mementos of their victims. If Morrison took personal items from the children he murdered, he might still have them. And if there were other victims in San Francisco, Henry didn't want to think about how many families might still be waiting for answers about their missing children. But one thing was certain. Emma Hartwell and the other 3 girls had been just the beginning of Arthur Morrison's killing spree, not the end. The phone rang, interrupting their conversation. Castellanos answered it with his usual brusque efficiency, but Henry watched his expression change from professional interest to stunned disbelief. "Are you absolutely certain about this?" Castellanos asked into the phone. "And you're willing to testify to what you just told me?" He listened for another moment, then hung up and turned to Henry with a look of grim satisfaction. "That was Margaret Morrison Caldwell, calling from Sacramento. She says Arthur Morrison is her father." Henry felt his pulse quicken. His own daughter is calling in a tip? She saw the newspaper story this morning and recognized her father's name. Apparently Arthur Morrison has been living quietly in Daly City for the past 15 years, but here's the crucial detail. He's been suffering from dementia for the last 5 years. His memory is failing, and according to his daughter, he's been talking about things that happened in his past, things about children and orange groves and burying secrets in the ground. He's been confessing? In a way. Margaret Caldwell said her father has been having what she thought were nightmares, waking up in the middle of the night, talking about little girls who won't leave him alone, girls in white dresses who stand at the foot of his bed, staring at him with accusing eyes. Henry's camera bag seemed to grow heavier on his shoulder. The ghostly children hadn't just been appearing to him, they'd been haunting Arthur Morrison for years, maybe decades. As his mental defenses weakened with age and illness, the spirits of his victims had been closing in, demanding justice that had been denied for far too long. "Margaret Caldwell wants to cooperate fully with the investigation," Castellanos continued. "She's agreed to help us approach her father, to try to get him to confess before his dementia progresses any further. She also mentioned that he has boxes of old things in his garage, items he's kept for decades but never talks about. When do we go to San Francisco?" "Tomorrow morning. I've arranged for SFPD backup and I want you there to document everything. If Arthur Morrison is finally ready to confess to what he did to those children, I want every word recorded." As Henry left the sheriff's department, he couldn't shake the feeling that Emma and the other murdered children were closer than ever to getting the justice they deserved. The media attention had worked exactly as planned, flushing Arthur Morrison out of hiding and putting pressure on a killer who thought he was safe from his crimes. But Henry also knew that cornered predators were dangerous, especially ones who had nothing left to lose. Arthur Morrison had managed to evade justice for 60 years through cunning and his father's protection. Now facing exposure and prosecution as an old man with a failing mind, there was no telling what he might do to protect himself. The final confrontation was approaching, and Henry had the unsettling feeling that the ghostly children would be there to witness it, ready to see their killer face the consequences of his actions. After 6 decades of freedom, justice had been delayed, but it would not be denied. The drive to Daly City took Henry and Detective Castellanos through the rolling hills south of San Francisco, past neat suburban developments that had sprung up after World War II to house the families of returning veterans. Arthur Morrison's address led them to a modest ranch house on a quiet street lined with similar homes, where children rode bicycles on sidewalks and mothers pushed baby carriages toward the local market. It was the kind of neighborhood where a man could disappear into comfortable anonymity where no one asked too many questions about their neighbors' pasts. The perfect place for a killer to spend his retirement years, surrounded by the kind of innocent family life he had destroyed decades earlier in the orange groves of Anaheim. Margaret Morrison Caldwell was waiting for them on the front porch, a woman in her 50s with graying hair and the weary expression of someone who had just learned that her entire understanding of her father was built on lies. She greeted them with nervous efficiency, her hands shaking slightly as she led them toward the front door. "He's having a good day today," she told them quietly. "The dementia comes and goes, but this morning he seemed lucid. He even asked about the newspaper headlines, though I don't think he understands the connection to himself yet." "Mrs. Caldwell," Castellanos said gently, "I want you to understand that once we begin questioning your father, there's no going back. If he confesses to these murders, he'll be arrested and charged regardless of his mental condition." Margaret nodded firmly. "I've thought about this all night, Detective. Those children deserve justice, and their families deserve answers. If my father is responsible for what happened to them, then he needs to face the consequences." The living room was typical of an elderly man's home, comfortable but sparse, with furniture that had been purchased decades earlier and never replaced. Family photographs lined the mantelpiece, showing Arthur Morrison at various stages of his life, as a young man in the 1920s, as a husband and father in the 1940s, as a grandfather in more recent years. To anyone looking at these images, he would appear to be nothing more than an ordinary American man who had lived a full and unremarkable life. Arthur Morrison himself sat in a worn leather armchair near the window, staring out at the suburban street with vacant eyes. At 78 he was still a large man, though age had stooped his shoulders and thinned his once dark hair to wispy grey strands. His hands, which had once been strong enough to overpower terrified children, now shook with the tremors of advancing Parkinson's disease. But it was his eyes that made Henry's blood run cold. Even clouded by dementia and age, there was something predatory in Arthur Morrison's gaze, something that suggested the monster was still there beneath the facade of a harmless old man. "Dad," Margaret said softly, "there are some people here who want to talk to you about the old days in Anaheim." Morrison's head turned slowly toward them, his eyes struggling to focus. "Anaheim," he repeated, his voice a dry whisper. "Haven't thought about that place in years. Orange trees everywhere, sweet smell in the air, good place for children to play." Henry felt his skin crawl at the way Morrison said those last words, as if he were savoring a pleasant memory. He raised his camera and began taking photographs, documenting every moment of what might be the most important interrogation in Orange County history. Detective Castellanos pulled out a tape recorder and set it on the coffee table. "Mr. Morrison, I'm Detective Ray Castellanos with the Orange County Sheriff's Department. I'd like to ask you some questions about your time in Anaheim in 1923. 1923. Morrison's eyes grew distant, and for a moment Henry thought they'd lost him to the fog of dementia. But then his expression sharpened, and when he spoke again, his voice was clearer, more focused. "That was the year I worked for old man Hartwell. Had a pretty little daughter, Emma, always playing in the orange groves with her dolls." Margaret Caldwell gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. This was the first time she'd heard her father speak specifically about the murdered children, and the casual way he mentioned Emma's name made it clear that his memories of that time were far from faded. "Tell me about Emma Hartwell," Castellanos said carefully. "What do you remember about her?" Morrison smiled, and Henry felt his stomach turn. It was the smile of a predator remembering his prey. "Beautiful child, trusting. Used to follow me around when I was working on the farm, asking questions about everything, always carrying that porcelain doll of hers." His smile faded, replaced by something darker. "Got too curious for her own good." "What happened to Emma, Arthur?" For a long moment Morrison said nothing, but Henry could see something changing in his expression, a battle between the dementia that clouded his mind and the memories that had haunted him for 60 years. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. "She saw me with the Chen girl, little Patricia. Emma came running through the orange trees calling for help." Morrison's hands clenched into fists. "Couldn't let her tell anyone what she'd seen. Couldn't let anyone know what I'd done." The confession hit the room like a physical blow. Margaret Caldwell began crying softly, while Detective Castellanos leaned forward, his professional calm barely masking his disgust. "What did you do to Emma, Arthur?" "Same thing I did to the others, quick and clean. Buried them deep where no one would ever find them." Morrison's eyes found Henry's camera lens, and for a moment he seemed to see something else entirely. But they found me anyway, didn't they? All these years standing at the foot of my bed, staring at me with those accusing eyes. Emma and Patricia and Mary and little Susan, never aging, never forgiving. Henry's finger froze on the shutter button as he realized what Morrison was describing. The ghostly children hadn't just been appearing to him and Rose Chen, they'd been haunting their killer for decades, growing stronger as his mental defenses weakened with age. There were others, weren't there? Castellanos pressed. Other children after you moved to San Francisco? Morrison nodded slowly. Hard to stop once you start. The hunger, the need, it grows inside you like a cancer. But I was careful up here, smarter. Never more than one every few years, never from the same neighborhood. The magnitude of Arthur Morrison's crimes was becoming clear. 4 murdered children in Anaheim had been just the beginning of a killing spree that had continued for decades, hidden behind the respectability of a steady job and a normal family life. How many? Castellanos asked quietly. 17, Morrison whispered, and Margaret Caldwell's sobs grew louder. 17 over 30 years. All buried in different places, all alone in the dark. Henry continued photographing, documenting every word of a confession that would finally bring closure to families who had waited decades for answers. But as he worked, he became aware of movement at the edges of his vision. The ghostly children were gathering, not just Emma and the 3 others from Anaheim, but more figures, dozens of them, standing silently around the perimeter of the room. 17 victims, Arthur Morrison had said, and they were all here, waiting to witness justice finally being served. Through his camera lens, Henry saw them clearly for the first time. Children from different eras, wearing clothes from the 1920s through the 1950s, their faces bearing the terrible innocence that had been stolen from them. But they no longer looked desperate or pleading. They looked satisfied, vindicated, as if their long wait for justice was finally coming to an end. Detective Castellanos was reading Arthur Morrison his rights, preparing to arrest him for murders that had been committed over 3 decades, but Henry knew that the real judgment had already been passed by a jury of 17 murdered children who had refused to rest until their killer was exposed. As the handcuffs clicked around Arthur Morrison's wrists, Henry caught one final glimpse of Emma Hartwell through his viewfinder. She was smiling, not with malice or revenge, but with the simple satisfaction of a child who had finally been heard after 60 years of silence. The nightmare that had begun in the orange groves of Anaheim was finally coming to an end. The arrest of Arthur Morrison sent shockwaves through communities from Anaheim to San Francisco, as families who had lost children decades earlier finally learned the truth about what had happened to their loved ones. Henry found himself at the center of a media storm that stretched far beyond his original assignment to document Walt Disney's theme park construction. The Orange County Courthouse became a focal point for grieving families, reporters, and curiosity seekers, as Morrison was charged with 17 counts of first-degree murder spanning 3 decades. Despite his dementia, psychiatrists declared him competent to stand trial, though his confession had already provided enough evidence to ensure conviction. Henry stood in the courthouse hallway, his camera documenting the faces of family members who had waited most of their lives for this moment. Rose Chen, now vindicated after 60 years of carrying her terrible secret, wept openly as she spoke to reporters about finally getting justice for her sister Patricia. "I never stopped believing that someday the truth would come out," she said, her voice steady despite her tears. "Patricia and the other children deserved better than to be forgotten, buried in unmarked graves while their killer lived free. Today, they finally have their voices back." Thomas and Margaret Hartwell's surviving relatives had traveled from across the country to witness Morrison's arraignment. Emma's cousins and nieces, people who had grown up hearing whispered stories about the little girl who had vanished from the family farm, finally had answers to questions that had haunted their family for generations. But it was Walt Disney's reaction that surprised Henry most. Rather than simply walking away from the disaster that had destroyed his Anaheim project, Disney had thrown his full support behind efforts to memorialize the murdered children. He announced that he would donate the entire Anaheim property to Orange County for use as a memorial park, ensuring that Emma Hartwell and the other victims would never be forgotten. "These children died because of evil," Disney told the packed courthouse steps, "but their memory will live on as a reminder of innocence protected and justice served. The land where they rest will become a place of peace and remembrance, not commerce." Henry's photographs of the ghostly children had become some of the most controversial evidence in the case. Skeptics dismissed them as tricks of light or photographic manipulation, but believers saw them as proof that the spirits of the murdered children had guided the investigation from beyond the grave. The images were featured in newspapers and magazines across the country, sparking debates about life after death and the possibility of supernatural justice. Detective Castellanos had worked tirelessly to connect Morrison's confession to missing children cases throughout California. The killer's detailed knowledge of burial sites and personal effects had led to the recovery of 13 additional bodies, bringing closure to families who had given up hope decades earlier. Morrison kept trophies from every victim, Castellanos explained to Henry as they reviewed evidence from the killer's Daly City home. Jewelry, photographs, pieces of clothing. He couldn't bear to completely let go of them, even after all these years. The basement of Morrison's house had yielded a horrific collection of mementos, small shoes, hair ribbons, toys, and most disturbingly, photographs that Morrison had taken of his victims before killing them. The images were too terrible for public release, but they provided undeniable proof of his guilt and helped identify children who might otherwise have remained anonymous. Henry found himself struggling with the aftermath of the investigation. The photographs he had taken, particularly those showing the ghostly children, had made him a reluctant celebrity in paranormal circles. Talk show hosts and magazine editors constantly called, wanting to hear his account of how the spirits had guided him to uncover the truth. But the attention felt wrong somehow, as if he were profiting from the suffering of murdered children. The real heroes of this story were the victims themselves: Emma, Patricia, Mary, Susan, and the 13 others who had refused to rest until their killer was brought to justice. 3 months after Morrison's arrest, Henry returned to the Anaheim construction site one final time. The heavy equipment was gone, replaced by landscapers who were transforming the former crime scene into the memorial park that Disney had envisioned. Native plants and memorial gardens were being installed around the areas where the children's bodies had been discovered. As the sun set over the orange groves that still surrounded the property, Henry set up his camera one last time. He wanted to document the transformation of this cursed land into something peaceful and healing, a place where families could come to remember children whose lives had been cut tragically short. Through his camera lens, he saw them one final time, the ghostly children standing among the newly planted trees and flowers. But they looked different now, less desperate and more at peace. Emma Hartwell stepped forward from the group, her translucent figure solid enough that Henry could see her clearly with his naked eye. She smiled at him, the same innocent smile he had seen in her family photographs, and mouthed 2 words: "Thank you." One by one, the other children stepped forward to offer their own silent gratitude. Patricia Chen with her silk ribbon, Mary Sullivan with her wooden horse, Susan Martinez with her silver cross, and the 13 others whose names Henry had learned during the investigation. They were no longer trapped earthbound spirits seeking justice. They were children ready to find their rest. As Henry watched through his viewfinder, the ghostly figures began to fade, becoming translucent and then disappearing entirely into the warm California evening. The last to go was Emma, who looked directly into his camera lens one final time before dissolving into particles of light that drifted upward toward the stars. Henry lowered his camera and stood in the silence that followed. The construction site where Walt Disney's dream had been shattered was now quiet and peaceful, no longer haunted by the desperate pleas of murdered children. The spirits had found their justice, the killer was behind bars, and the families finally had closure. Arthur Morrison would spend whatever remained of his life in prison, his legacy forever linked to the 17 innocent lives he had stolen. But the children themselves would be remembered not as victims, but as the brave souls who had refused to let evil triumph, who had reached across decades of silence to ensure that truth finally prevailed. The memorial park would open to the public in 6 months, featuring gardens dedicated to each of the 17 victims and a monument bearing their names. Visitors would come to pay their respects, to remember children who had been forgotten by everyone except the orange trees that had grown over their graves. And somewhere in the distance, carried on the evening breeze, Henry could swear he heard the sound of children laughing, not the desperate cries of trapped spirits, but the joyful voices of souls finally free to play in whatever paradise awaited them beyond this world. Justice had been served, peace had been restored, and the dead could finally rest. 1 year later, Henry Blackwood stood at the entrance to the Emma Hartwell Memorial Park, watching families walk quietly along the garden paths that now covered the ground where bulldozers had once torn through orange groves. The transformation was remarkable. What had been a construction site scarred by tragedy was now a place of beauty and remembrance, where children played safely under the watchful eyes of parents who understood the precious fragility of innocence. The memorial itself was a masterpiece of understated elegance. 17 small bronze plaques marked the spots where the children's bodies had been found, each surrounded by flowering plants that bloomed year-round in the Southern California climate. At the center of the park stood a statue of a little girl holding a doll, her face turned upward toward the sky with an expression of hope and peace. The inscription at the base simply read, "In memory of Emma Rose Hartwell and 16 other children, whose voices were silenced, but whose spirits refused to surrender. May they rest in the peace they were denied in life." Henry's camera hung around his neck, but he rarely used it anymore for professional work. The investigation that had begun with a single photograph of Walt Disney and a mysterious doll's head had changed everything about how he viewed his craft. He no longer saw photography as simply a way to make a living, but as a sacred responsibility to bear witness to truth, no matter how painful or difficult that truth might be. Walt Disney had kept his promise to donate the land, despite the enormous financial loss it represented. The theme park project had been permanently abandoned, though Disney had announced plans for a new location further south in Orange County, on land with no tragic history. The Anaheim site would remain forever dedicated to the memory of the murdered children. It was never about the money, Disney had told Henry during their final meeting. It was about creating joy for children. But you can't build joy on a foundation of suffering. These children deserve better than to have their resting place turned into an amusement park. This way, their memory becomes part of something meaningful and lasting. Arthur Morrison had been sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole, though his deteriorating mental condition meant he would likely spend his remaining years in a psychiatric facility. His daughter Margaret had moved away from California, unable to bear the weight of her father's crimes and the constant media attention that followed the case. But it was Rose Chen who had undergone the most remarkable transformation. The elderly woman who had carried a terrible secret for 60 years had become an advocate for cold case investigations, using her experience to encourage other witnesses to come forward with long-buried information about unsolved crimes. "Silence protects evil," she had told a gathering of law enforcement officials. "When we stay quiet about the monsters we've seen, we become complicit in their crimes. Patricia and the other children taught me that truth has its own power, and that power grows stronger with time, not weaker." Henry had compiled his photographs from the investigation into a book titled Voices from the Grove, A Photographer's Journey into Justice. The proceeds went entirely to a foundation established in the victims' names, providing support for families of missing children and funding for cold case investigations. The most controversial images, those showing the ghostly children, were included with detailed explanations of the circumstances under which they were taken. He never claimed to understand how or why his camera had been able to capture the spirits of the murdered children. Scientists and skeptics offered various explanations, from light refraction to psychological suggestion, but Henry had stopped caring about rational explanations. What mattered was that the children had found a way to communicate their desperate need for justice, and that communication had ultimately led to their killer's capture. On this anniversary afternoon, Henry walked slowly through the memorial park, photographing the peaceful scenes of families enjoying the gardens and children, playing safely in the areas that had once been crime scenes. But he was also looking for something else, hoping against hope that he might catch one final glimpse of the spirits who had changed his life so profoundly. Near the statue of Emma Hartwell, he noticed a little girl about 6 years old, playing with a porcelain doll while her mother read on a nearby bench. The child was blonde with blue eyes, and for just a moment, Henry's breath caught in his throat. But when he raised his camera and looked through the viewfinder, he saw only a living child engaged in innocent play, exactly as it should be. The dead children were truly at rest now, their voices heard, and their justice served. The memorial park belonged to the living, to new generations of children who would grow up safe and protected, unaware of the tragedy that had preceded their joy. As the sun began to set behind the orange groves that still surrounded the park, casting long shadows across the memorial gardens, Henry packed up his camera equipment for the final time at this site. His work here was finished, his witness to justice complete. But as he walked toward the parking lot, he heard something that made him smile, the sound of children's laughter drifting across the evening air. Not the ghostly voices of murdered spirits, but the vibrant, joyful sounds of children at play, children whose innocence was protected by parents who understood its value and by a community that had learned from tragedy. Emma Hartwell and the 16 others had not died in vain. Their story had exposed evil, brought justice, and ultimately created something beautiful from something terrible. The memorial park would stand as a testament to their courage and a reminder that truth, however long delayed, will always find a way to surface. Henry started his car and drove away from the memorial park for the last time, carrying with him the knowledge that sometimes the most important photographs are the ones that capture not just what the eye can see, but what the heart knows to be true. The children's voices had been silenced by a monster, but their spirits had found a way to speak across decades of silence, ensuring that love and justice would ultimately triumph over evil. In the rearview mirror, he could see the statue of Emma Hartwell silhouetted against the orange and pink sky, her stone face turned upward in eternal hope. The nightmare that began in 1923 was finally over, replaced by the promise of new beginnings and the quiet certainty that innocence, once lost, could still be honored and protected for generations to come. The memorial park would welcome visitors for decades to come, but Henry knew that its real purpose had already been served. 17 murdered children had found their peace, a serial killer had faced justice, and a community had learned that some things are more important than progress or profit. Sometimes the most magical place on earth is simply a place where truth is told and justice is served, no matter how long it takes to arrive.